Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of an VNture podcast with your hosts, Taros113 and MR. Today's episode is going to be about villains in visual novels. Every good story needs a good villain, and today we wanted to go over the topic of villains in a story and what makes a good villain, and some memorable ones from titles we've read. And so MR will take us off with a quick overview of villains.
Yeah, before we dive into our examples, I wanted to go over what I outline when it comes to characteristics that makes a villain. And I divided that in 3 categories. First, I named cause, with 2 extreme ends. Well, on one end, we have a villain that is a force of nature. That villain just was born evil. That's it. There's no deeper purpose. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a sympathetic villains. Villains that became such given circumstances and what happened to them that led them astray. That's one characteristic.
And you mentioned like spectrum, right? I think that's a good way of looking at it. How influenced their origin is by just nature versus nurture.
Yes, exactly. And probably the most famous force of nature in popular culture would be the Joker, right? From the Batman. Yeah. And again, they exist outside of VN, but we'll obviously have examples specifically in VN. So that's the one thing, cause. The other is execution, is how they go about their villainy. And again, the 2 extreme ends on the spectrum is chaotic, so the villain just wants the world burn and does that completely chaotically. And the other side of the spectrum is they do so orderly, meaning they have planned, they have grand vision, grand design. Organized crime falls into that category more or less.
Organized crime, absolutely.
Yeah. Again, in order to run a criminal empire, you kinda need some degree of order. So those fall into this category. And the last category is the morality. And again, the same spectrum applies. On one end, you have people who are completely amoral, abandon everything that even pertains to human rights or your beliefs system. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, we have people who are honorable, maybe a villain with a heart of gold that has some redeeming quality in terms of how they approach their villainy and how they even conduct themselves during that.
Because to a certain degree, every villain thinks they're in the right. So even if, one villain might think they're in the right, and that might makes right, and they can just take whatever they want because they have the firepower or strength to do it. But I see what you mean. And then on the honorable end, some people think they're truly making the world a better place for everyone with their villainous actions, right?
Yes, but again, there's so many examples on this, and the spectrum is quite wide, meaning there would be those who are honorable and they do so by killing the enemies they fought, but in the most painless way possible. When are those that honorable and they let live those they defeated? Again, there's many steps to it. There's a lot of things going on, but they are still, at the end of the day, they are villains for the story. And what's important to outline in those characteristics is there's more than just more to villain than just a chaotic representation of evil. They can be complex, they can be simple, they can have deep motives, they can just be, depending on the story itself and the villain, it can be many different points in all those spectrums. For better or worse, because some combinations work better in certain stories than others. With that being said, especially on the point of extremes, I prepared my most representative of extremes example, that being Beat Blaze Haruka. It's a story focusing around student at the academy, living an ordinary school life. Surely, nothing supernatural would disrupt that, would it? But it just so happened, on one of those innocent days, he is attacked by mysterious masked ninja, and this even throws his life out of whack. Fast forward, he joins a military group that combats threat for his city that will be overrun by villains. And truth be told, that setup is the most boring part of the game and stories. I'm sorry. Because it's the most mediocre approach of threat. Unknown dark forces going to surround the city, that's it.
I mean, I get what you're saying, but that's because Beat Blaze Haruka is a Nukige, so it's more focused on a few other aspects than the story, you know?
Again, fair enough. That's why I wanted, because I agree with you. I know it's Nukige, yet it showcases the most extreme kind of villains. One, the setup is really weak. Really one. But, on the other hand, the villain they cast as your obstacles, they are so crazy. I would divide them into three distinctive types in that game. One type is the comedic villain, the reoccurring weekly threat. So kind of akin to a serial you would watch on TV. That each week you get a new villain, the group of heroes defeat the villain, that's it. Tune in next week. And that's exactly the way this game did. Every chapter, there's a new crazy villain. And my personal favorite example was a villain that hated people who refused to eat mushrooms. So his aim is to go to the restaurants and add shiitake mushrooms to every table, to every dinner people had.
Whether they like it or not, they will appreciate shiitake mushrooms.
Exactly. And that was so quirky, so fun, and so absurd. I just laughed when playing that really night. There was another one, let me give you a few examples, that had a he was delivering intense punishment to the most mundane crimes available. So, for example, you crossed the street on the red light, and he immediately wants to punish you. You thrown trash into the trash bin, but you missed, so he wants to punish you for it. The most crazy, over-the-top, completely mismatched to the crime punishment for what just ordinary people just messed up.
Because when you have serialized characters who are just supposed to be the enemy of the week for this little short mini arc, it's important to make them memorable. And of course, you can't really build very complex characters in that short of a time. So it's easier to just go to ridiculous extremes and you go for the shock value or the comedy instead. And that's great because it makes them memorable for the short time you see them, right?
Exactly. This is exactly what I'm trying to point out. A lot of things in that game was forgettable, but not villains. They were so polarizing with the recurring villains of the week, so absurdish, completely out of whack, but you just encounter them, defeat them, move on. That's it. But they were so comedic, funny, and the banter between the main character trying to defeat them and their replies were so hilarious. I remember them for that. So definitely they were on the force of nature, chaotic, and the morality depends. But force of nature, chaotic, definitely. On the other hand, the same game with the most boring setup ever. So no group of villains tries to take over the city, whatever. They had masterminds. So in addition to weekly recurring villains, you had like 2 masterminds, maybe 3, something like that. And they actually were written so much differently because they were not force of nature. They definitely aim more for a sympathetic villains. All of them were a victim of circumstances, meaning they turned to be a villain due to their hatred of humanity, influenced by the things that happened in their life. And you keep reading that, and you get clash between the most absurdish villains ever possible and the guy who lost his family because a lord liked his paintings, so he painted paintings for that lord. And in order to retain the value of those paintings, the lord killed his family, so there is no future artist to depreciate the value of art, and gouged his eyes so he cannot make more paintings. That's tragic. I can sympathize. He got wronged. And it was such a clash between the style of villainy. This is the only thing I truly and vividly remember to this day about that game.
I mean, yeah, you'd need to have that contrast too, especially with the main villains, overarching the story, because they're the eventual end goal. They're the ones that you're trying to get strong enough to defeat in the meantime and save the city. So they need to be as despicable as the story needs them to be.
And it's just that approach to villainy is something very interesting to showcase in the same game. The comedic angle and the very serious, sympathetic, you try to understand in kinda, you want them get justice for what happened to them before.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
Mm-hmm. But then, you can't have the entire story be that heavy and miserable. And then that's what all the comedic parts are for. To let off some steam and laugh about things for a while.
Exactly. And going back to the point you outlined, this being Nukiga, beating the villains, not only resolution. You could also lose to them. You can take what you can.
Yeah, and that's its own matter for unrelated story content.
Yeah, you can imagine what happened, then you can do with that information as you want. But the most important part with my argument, and why did I bring it up, the more you lose, the more you lose support of people you defend.
Obviously, you can't lose against the important scripted story battles, but there's a lot of free battles as you go around and train and save the city, and if you keep failing too many of those, then the citizens lose faith in you.
Exactly, and interesting angle they went with, because seeing that as a superhero who defends citizens, you also become jaded as a result. And this is why this game has very interesting endings, in which you, as a defender of the city, can become the villain and join the ranks in exactly the same manner. They become evil. You want to bring the injustice happened to you upon those citizens back. I'm like, that's a very interesting approach.
Oh dear. Okay. In fact, that's one of the things I love about visual novels. You get to see little what-if branches like these. And you're mentioning like the heroes wind up following the same paths the villains do?
Again, although villains have some hatred to humanity, and the heroes becoming jaded, stop believing in their quest to defend the citizens. So that's their path. So given those circumstances and bad things that happened to them as a result of them losing, and citizens mocking them for losing and not supporting their quest of defending their very citizens, they go on the path of becoming the villain. And oddly enough, even in that, there's also a split. You can become the jaded, let's say, villain that seeks the injustice fixed, or you can become the comedic villains yourself, which is the most hilarious part. So you can become the edgy person, like, no, those citizens are so wrong, they turn our backs on me. Or you can become blue and be super evil. And I'm not kidding, the true evil route is you change your skin tone to blue. That's stupid.
Yeah, interesting.
Again, that's why I chose specifically this as an example. It has the most extreme approaches to villainy I remember. And in my opinion, it uses this to good effect. The story isn't deep. I mean, it's not aiming to, but at the very least showcases interesting approach to becoming a villain and having some variety of villains. And to this day, I remember that for that specific reason.
On my end, for VNs I instantly thought of when we discussed the topic of villains, I actually want to go to 428 Shibuya Scramble.
Okay.
Because it's set in the modern day, and interestingly enough, you follow 5 totally different characters who are all going through their own very different struggles in this day. Like there's a reporter who's trying to get together enough stories to save the publishing company from going out of business. You have one biological researcher who's going through some difficult family times and balancing his work and home life. But the main story going on is for the police officer who is overseeing a kidnapping ransom handoff. And things very quickly go off the rails, and as he continues investigating this case throughout the day, it turns into something far bigger than he imagined at the start. And then, over the course of 428, all of these characters' stories intertwine in various ways, and a lot of the fun is in seeing how things resolve. Now, 428 is a very exaggerated VN. All of the characters are are very exaggerated in their mannerisms and personalities. There's very little subtlety among the cast. And it's an interesting foil because you quickly discover that the mastermind villain behind this is an individual named Alphard. And the police don't know anything about Alphard, so it makes them very much a kind of mastermind villain working in the background. And despite everyone's eagerness and, reckless actions, always rushing from one place to another, trying to save everyone and doing good in the world, you have this evil character always in the background who they just cannot seem to grasp. And I think this villain, first popped into my mind about this topic because it's such a great contrast between the eagerness involved in 428's cast, and then just like the brutal, realistic mystery involved, where they don't even know Alfred's gender at all. So that's why I have to keep referring to them as them. And it's very frustrating to them, to the characters, because no matter how hard they're rushing about the city, trying to get some leads, making some progress, all it takes is for some mastermind to orchestrate something behind the scenes and things blow up in their face. Literally. Because Alphard does like to utilize remote detonated bombs. And so there's always that, I guess you could say, sense of dread in the background. that no matter how much progress they're making on the case, things could go awry anywhere at any time.
The way you describe 428, whenever you speak about that title, I never know where to put it specifically. I mean, I already have problems when we prepare the screenshots. I need to do a double take. Wait, is that a visual? Oh, yeah, it's visual novel. Okay. It looks such like a movie or something like shot in real action.
Mm-hmm.
And now that you... previously you talked about how the roads intertwine and people choices in other routes affect other characters' perspectives, right? And all of that intertwine at some point. And now you add also the mystery of a villain who kinda behaves like a character straight out of horror movie.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say quite like a horror movie. It's like 428 Shibuya Scramble is shot entirely with live action scenes instead of the typical anime hand-drawn or computer-generated styles, which is great because, like you mentioned, 428 really emulates a live-action TV series. It's structured similarly, and of course the live-action shots help. And you also get mini arcs that stretch across individual episodes or whatnot with a wide cast. And just like how you were talking about with Beatblade's Haruka, there's the overarching villain who is a stark contrast to all the comedy in between. And all of the heroes need to unite to take Alfred down. And I think that's one of the biggest things that contributes to this whole TV series feel. Because it's something a lot of readers notice whenever they read 428, but you can't really pin down the reasons besides the obvious of the visuals and the cast. And I was thinking about the story, and a lot of the story, what makes it tick so well, is having Alfred as a villain. Because it adds that element of mystery and danger to what would otherwise be a very comedic visual novel.
Okay, fair enough. When it comes to my horror angle, I went with, I meant more in a they use in Shibuya Scramble, from what I hear from you, the mystery of the villain as a increasing the tension. And again, like a horror, when you scare yourself by imagining what the monster or threat can look like, but it's never shown, kinda is similar to what you described with Shibuya Scramble. You never see the villain, you are uncertain who he or she or what that is, and the mystery goes on. Whereas, in contrast, a lot of, be it movies, be it anime, be it VNs, even if the protagonists don't encounter the villain, you as a player see the villain behind the scenes. So that's the difference from what I gather. And the horror angle, again, it doesn't have to be horror. I'm just saying it borrows from horror the aspect of fear of the unknown.
I see what you mean. Yeah, because there is that fear, and I think you mentioned offhand, a large part of what makes this work is because of it increases the pacing. Especially early on in 428, there's a lot of stuff going on, and you kind of just address things on a case-by-case basis. But once the mastermind starts putting plans into motion, then now you have a goal in mind. Now you're sometimes behind the 8-ball, and you're running like chickens with their heads cut off. And so I think that's what you mean by adding a potential horror aspect to the mix, in the case that you get that sense of dread.
Yeah.
I don't mean to say that the entire VN is like that. Of course, it's the overarching plot, and there's still plenty of comedy and ridiculous characters. And,
I can imagine.
And the episodic enemies in between to take down. But there is always that layer slapped onto the top of 428.
Because the other feeling I get, in addition to what you just described, so having smaller fish that you deal with, but also behind all of that, the master villain, the puppeteer. The other thing I immediately think, and probably this is why I envision this is the most, the very Tauros-esque VN, is probably this kind of play on cat and mouse. Kind of reminds me of a battle of wits style of storytelling, when you have people on two sides outwitting each other, be it detective mystery, or I don't know, the classic is Death Note anime that has a battle of wits element to it. How can you outwit the other person?
Yes, absolutely. Especially when you have a the most main character of the police officer involved. And yes, it does lead to a lot of detectiving, a lot of chasing plot leads, and being thwarted at certain turns. Yeah, you're right. That whole cat and mouse aspect is really what makes 428 a lot more exciting, in my mind.
Okay.
So yeah, that's definitely how the villain plays into 428's story. I think it does it very well, so I'm happy about that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Again, hearing you not the first time speaking about the title, I'm convinced more and more how very much a Tauros title this is.
Oh no, I'm getting typecast.
Yes, you are. Yeah.
What kind of an MR title do you have then? That's fine. If you're gonna poke fun at me, then what about you?
I mean, that's actually a good transition to the next topic, because I do believe I took a gamble, as I did with many Kickstarters. Not all of them I liked. Many of them I didn't play. But this one I tried. I played, and I'm instantly fan of the series Venus Blood. Oh boy, how can I start that? And how I frame it? Well, let's start with the basics. This is a story that takes place in a fantasy world. So this is fantasy. In a continent known as Floating Continent of Yggdrasil, protected by divine beings and goddesses of the seasons. Okay. Our protagonist, Loki, hails from the fallen aristocratic House of Demons, sets out to counter the Yggdrasil land in the name of their leader, the Demon Lord. But unbeknownst to Demon Lord, Loki has ambition for an empire of his own, and thus the story begins. And with that setup, I specifically picked that title because the premise immediately flips. You are the baddies, as to quote the popular meme.
Yeah,
we are the baddies.
I was about to ask. This kind of sounds like you're more of the villainous role here, huh?
Yes. So that is an interesting twist. Whereas in my example of Beat Blake Saroka, you had an opportunity to turn evil if you follow the path exactly as the villains you were defeating. Whereas Venus Blood, you could... it's not much of a power of friendship in anime, but you can be more honorable and become more orderly and become the hero instead of villain. So this game has a very clear split between following in the footsteps of your origins, being a demon and evil guy and ending that way normally, or you could turn around your nature and turn the other leaf and become the hero. And depending on which path you choose, you will face your opposite. So in case if you continue being the villain, you'll face the heroic antagonist. Whereas if you become the hero and you want to turn the other leaf, then your demons won't like that. So that's a very interesting twist to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I always love when visual novels have branching story paths so that you can explore what happens if I approach this situation differently. I always love that, yeah.
This is one of those titles in which you use power of friendship. Again, I'm using that term very loosely, okay?
Yes.
You turn your enemies into your allies. But that's the basic premise. Not necessarily in the nicest methods available. Again, this being dark fantasy and you being the villain. But ultimately, you do convert people and they follow your footsteps, whether or not that being one of tyranny and continuing being evil, or maybe they influence you enough so you're no longer with your evil nature and you reject that. So that's an interesting twist. Yes, you get to invade lands, you get foiled by many divine beings, angels and the like, and maybe, just maybe, you have an opportunity to reason from their side of the story.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, another point is that it is rooted quite a lot in the Norse mythology, so I had a lot of fun digging that up. Again, the protagonist being Loki kind of spoils that. But
you mentioned something earlier about how the villains of the story change depending on the kind of path you take.
Yes.
And so when you, or the main character, want to take a more heroic approach to things, then who's the villain?
Well, we need to remember always when it comes to villainy, it's not uncommon that villains fight amongst themselves. So in this way also, your brethren, let's say, your demon kind don't like you being a hero, right? So you face your own faction from before.
I see.
It makes sense.
Oh, absolutely, you're right. It then becomes more of a power struggle instead of anything as grand as ideals or whatnot. Well, or maybe that's the wrong way to say it.
I think power struggle always exists within typical evil faction and structures. I mean, especially demons. They have their own hierarchy. Who is on the top? Who is the demon lord? I mean, hence the name, right? He's the main guy. And you have normal villain and you have subordinate, right? You have a hierarchy. So power struggle of how high you are on top of hierarchy is always built in. And that being the more amoral faction means there's more villainous things with the power struggle going on, right? So this is not news. But the moment you introduce the element of ideals, so you want to honor some ideals, and they reject that. Hence, they turn on you.
Yes. That's a very cool story. Very cool approach for the VN to take.
Yeah, this is one of those. I tried, I backed, I seen their success on Kickstarter. I tried the game, and I'm instantly fan of the series already.
They got you hooked.
Yeah, they got me. Sorry, I lost. Money wallet goes to Kickstarter. Bye. Yeah, they got me. Yeah, I tried on the first one. I backed a lot on the second one, and now they are having the Kickstarter for the third one. So yeah, they got me. They got me good.
In a good way, yeah.
In a good way.
They earned it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's definitely going to be a Kickstarter episode. I'm going to talk about what to do and what not to do. Expect this title to return, okay?
Ooh, Kickstarters. Yep, there's been some success stories and a whole lot of failures.
Yes, but before we got to that villainy,
real life villainy is too bad.
Yeah, I know.
Topic.
Yeah, but
so on that note,
yeah, I just wanted to finish out that they tied a lot of interesting gameplay elements also to that. Whereas oftentimes when you pursue villainy, pursue the evil power, might rules all, you get access to more powerful units, because again, this being a gameplay VN. And if you go the more lawful, heroic approach, you get access to more units. I mean, it makes sense if you think about it for a moment. You got more support from more kinds of people, more races, if you go the heroic approach. But you get more power, the raw strength, if you go for the pure evil approach. Also, this being one of those interesting titles that tries to completely avoid the gray moral area. And because the world is split into very much opposites, the one faction being very pro-evil, let's call it, and the other being pro-good. And you need to shake that status quo. You cannot go in between. It's impossible. You get thwarted by both at that point.
Ooh, ouch. Usually, a lot of stories never approach that line of thinking about trying to toe a line between the two sides, but apparently, like you're saying, if you do, then you just get squashed by both of them, huh?
Yes, exactly.
Very interesting.
Very unique. I like that.
Yep, Venus Blood Frontier. Okay.
Yeah. And with all that said, with all that villainy behind that, this is my last point of being absolute villain, because for all of us, our listeners, and us speaking, I need to end this.
No. But yes, this will be a stopping point for today's episode. Thank you, everyone, as usual, for listening in. If you have any comments or questions, please always let us know, either through YouTube comments or through emailing us, or reach us out through us at Twitter. We have a growing Twitter feed, so I would be very happy to give you a follow back as well.
Yep. And on my end, thank you everybody for listening, and have a good day.